Alrighty, so hello everyone, and welcome to today's live stream event where we are going to be talking about the topic of orchestration and the topic of MIDI realism. This is something that a lot of people have sort of been asking me about for quite some time, and today I just sort of want to cover the topic because it's a very, very broad topic, the topic of orchestration, and in specific MIDI realism, because there's so many samples out there, there's so many different approaches that one can do to obtain a really, really good sound. So today we're just going to look at it from a really, really wide sort of view, but we're also going to sort of take a look into different samples and stuff that you guys can use to get specific sounds, but also looking at how the instruments really work with each other, all of the sections of the orchestra, how it can be orchestrated inside of a DAW well to the point to where it will sound real, and how it can be mixed and how it can be sort of melded into what you would want to be able to sound realistic, but also sound powerful and meaningful. So today what we're really going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at a couple different pieces that I've sort of prepared for you guys. We're going to be breaking it down, talking about what I did, how I sort of made the decision on the orchestration that I went after. The first piece that we are doing is going to be a much more sort of John Williams-y, John Powell-esque, really fast orchestration style. And then following that, after we do that, we're going to sort of take a look at a more modern approach, and we're going to take a look at how I use string writing in that piece. Because, out of any instrument that a lot of people have been talking about in terms of MIDI realism, it's mainly been, strings. But, we'll sort of take a look at the brass and the winds, and the brass in specific. But we'll have another episode for the winds because they are so incredibly different from anything else, and they can be used very, very well, but they're harder to use than the brass and the strings, which is the fundamental reason why most people don't use winds nowadays, is because they're much harder to make sound, or they're much harder to feel like it's melded into a piece. One of the composers that I know that uses them very, very well is Harry Gregson Williams. Like, if you guys have heard the theme for Prometheus, it's very, very good. He uses these triplet bassoon lines under the main theme, actually, and that's something that not a lot of people would be scared to do that. Like, right when a piece opens on some big sci-fi film directed by Ridley Scott, having triplet bassoons under the main French horn theme, that's a pretty daring thing. But he knows his orchestration, he knows how instruments work together, and that's ultimately what allowed him to make that decision, because it's very important to acknowledge the fact that composers like John Williams, composers like James Newton Howard, who else? We have James Horner, Alan Silvestri. All these people sort of studied in the more classical way, which allowed them to be able to make decisions, logically, but also having the availability to be able to experiment with different sounds, textures, and how things double. And doubling is probably one of the most essential things that one needs to know in the film scoring world in specific, because doubling allows for you to create more colors. You guys might know the analogy, if you think about it, each different instrument is sort of like a different color, like in a color palette, right? And so if you're able to sort of mix the colors together, you're able to create more colors than there are, on that palette. And that's the cool thing about orchestral instruments. What a lot of people, refuse to do all the time is to develop and create different sounds, not necessarily by adding plugins and adding all of this, but actually melding sounds together and creating sounds. And there's a whole entire list, by the way, of different things that double extremely well. Whether it's flutes and high violins, or whether it's low timpani and the contrabass or whatever, or you have cellos and bassoons, all of that type of stuff. There's a big list on how things double and how you can actually use that doubling to create different sounds. And it's also very important to acknowledge that for example, John Williams in the Harry Potter score, at the beginning, Hedwig's theme, when it first comes in with the dun 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 dun, actually that is I believe it's an alto flute, it's an oboe, or no, it's an alto flute, an English horn, and a high register bassoon. So that's pretty much not a French horn. And then he saves the French horn where he really wants it to sort of puncture you, and he sort of builds that momentum using the woodwind section, and then he just hits with the brass, which is even more powerful. So that's also a very, very good thing to be able to do when it comes to orchestration, is to be able to sort of make those decisions, and to be able to sort of plan your piece ahead and be like, okay, so I want to build up to this section. I want to, really puncture the audience and really make them sort of feel this. And if you want to do that, you sort of need to build up. It's almost like diminishment, and then it sort of releases, or not diminishment, releases. Like sort of like if you were to have like a diminished chord and then you were to go to like the tonic chord. It's like very beautiful. It's a nice resolution, and that's why a lot of people use it. But that's the whole thing with like sort of orchestration too. As a matter of fact, a lot of these people, they'll sort of build it up and they'll build it up until bam. And that's sort of like, I don't know if you guys have heard me talk a little bit about Elgar, but Elgar was this amazing British composer. I believe he was a 19th and 20th century, early 20th century composer, and he was absolutely excellent. He wrote some of the most beautiful pieces of music. But what he would actually do, his sort of main approach to the whole world of orchestration and composition, is that what a lot of times he would do is he would pretty much start out by primarily and essentially only using inversions. Then from there he would sort of, his piece would continue until when he really wanted it to puncture you, he would use the actual root position chord. So that's something that's also a very, very good idea, is that using inversions almost creates a different sort of sound, and inversions are something that are really cool in comparison, in relationship with orchestration, because different inversions sound different, and going from one inversion to one inversion of this chord sounds fun, primarily very, very different than going from the root position chord to another root position chord. It's very, very nice. And if you guys are into trying something out, just sort of pull up a piano patch and try to play different inversions of chord. Like try to play like the first inversion of C minor to the root position of F minor, and then play like the the first inversion of C major, and everything flows together well. And that's something that really you have to keep in mind when orchestrating a piece inside of the DAW. It's understanding how the chords sort of meld into each other and how the transitions really are, because you want the transitions to be as smooth as possible. So the first thing we're going to start out with here is this little sort of piece that I wrote like sort of in the style of John Powell or John Williams. At first I really wanted to find some scene from like How to Train Your Dragon or something, but I couldn't find it. So I just sort of found this little scene from Star Wars, and I just sort of rescored it. So the actual video starts a little bit into the piece, but we're going to sort of listen to this, and then we'll dissect it and take a look at how I used orchestration in this type of fashion, and then we'll go on to how to use orchestration in a more modern, contemporary, epic style way. So here is that piece, the John Williams type piece. Awesome. So that should just give you a little idea of sort of what the goal of that piece was very much aimed towards, the whole John Williams-y type thing. Let's sort of talk through the orchestration on this piece, because the main goal of this piece was to sort of spread out the orchestration through the entire orchestra and show you guys how the whole entire orchestra works together to create one specific sound. So the piece starts out with this very sort of quick, pretty much chord progression that goes in the pretty much is in the brass section and a little bit in the string section, but mostly in the brass section. And it sort of does the F minor to E major to C sharp major to C major. And it pretty much goes. And as you guys can see, I orchestrated it throughout the brass section. So let's sort of take a look at how I orchestrated it in the brass. So in the brass section, you pretty much have your trumpets, you have your trombones, you have, you know, bass trombones, you, of course, have your tubas, your French horns, and then, of course, all the instruments that are sort of under those instruments, including, you know, the Descant Horn, the Wagner tuba, everything like that. You sort of can go from there, but you always have to start out first with the main brass section. So pretty much what we have going on here is we have the main sort of chord progression going very, very quick with these very quick triplets in the trumpets, and then we have the main chords being outlined in the trombones and in the French horns. And then in the tuba, we just sort of have the chord, roots. So like if we have like F minor, we have like, you know, the F, and we just sort of have that outlining it, and so it really punctures you. So sort of listen to. So as you guys could hear there, so this trumpet line is very, very quick, and it's very important that when you are orchestrating stuff like this, like something like, since it is so quick, you definitely want to get libraries that can play this quick. Like for example, you know, symphonic brass from, I believe it's Native Instruments and Sound Iron, that can't really handle this quick of thing. You know, you might want to, this is cine brass, so either cine brass or Berlin brass, anything like that, that'd probably be the best. So that's sort of puncturing the high section along with it being doubled by the high string section. So those are sort of working together, the high strings as well as the high brass, which of course is the trumpets, with the rest of the chords being outlined by the rest of the brass section. And then doubling that as well is a high woodwind section. Oh, that's sort of weird. So what we can do here, yeah, that is the regular 2D on there. You can turn it on the 2D staccato. Bam, there we go. So it's pretty much just doubling, which adds that little extra John Williams-y flair when you have the. Which sounds really, really cool, and it doubles well. And then as well as, you know, it has this little thing here where it goes like the. Which is like a very cool little accent, and you'll find a lot in this type of music, like especially in the golden age of film composition, that sort of era. They'll have cool things like this, where it just sort of comes out of nowhere, and it's like these cool little, you know, puncture. These cool little puncturing sort of phrases there. So that's sort of what the trumpets do, as well as the winds and the high string section. So as you guys can see there, they're all three working together in unison together there. But, you know, of course, we have our main melody in the, I believe it's the French horn. So we can sort of take a look here. This would be French horn. So you sort of see like the trombone has like a very aggressive sort of bite on it. So I use that as sort of like the, I used it one octave up from the tubas. So if you have like the tubas down here, let me turn this off. If you had it down here, I'll use like the trombones right here. So then if you double that, it has like a very, you know, and then you would have your French horns up here. And the French horns work very, very well in the midsection, and of course it goes down. I would probably go like probably G2 probably, G3, and then G4. So the French horns work really, really well in that midsection. They sound great. Then if you want to go even higher than that, I'd probably go for something like a Descant horn, which is, you know, a very, very good option because they sound awesome too. I recently did a review on the Descant horn, and it's an awesome sample library, as well as an awesome instrument. Most brass players who play, like for example, like in the Hollywood, in any big Hollywood orchestra or something like that, who record film scores, usually will have a Descant horn, or they will have like a Wagner tuba or something like that. It has very, very different. The primary thing about those isn't the change in like sort of tonality and how they actually sound, but it's the alteration in range and adapting what you're playing to the specific range of these instruments, like the Descant horn. So that's something to keep in mind. And so pretty much what we do here is we sort of go into this very sort of like actiony type feel. So as you guys can tell, what's happening in the video, there's sort of this chase thing going on. And it sort of starts out fun. It starts out like this big adventurous thing, and then it goes into this like very like aggressive sort of bitey, like sort of atonal. It has those clusters in there. That's right here. So as you guys can see here, the harmony sort of the harmony goes very, very it sort of opens up and it sounds very, very nice. So as you guys can tell, we sort of have this little phrase going on where it would be like, and then we sort of went up to that. And that all works very, very well because, we had so much dissonance there with that, oops, not that. With that. Then going up to that. It sounds very, very nice, and it sort of frees it all up. And then here I wanted to sort of here I wanted to sort of do this like sort of Star Wars-y type flowy harmony type thing, and so as you guys can tell, that's sort of orchestrated throughout the whole entire string sections, right? And it's very important to acknowledge what sort of role each of these stringed instruments have in the string section. I actually had this question via Facebook talking about what sort of do you use violin 2 for if you have the violas and everything like that. It's very important to acknowledge that if you look at any sort of like score, the violin 1s are usually going to get the harder parts. They're usually going to get the main parts. Violin 2s are going to, of course, be in the exact same register as the violin 1s, but they're usually going to get the secondary parts, whether it's filling in the harmony with the, in relationship with the violas and the cellos, helping fill in the harmony, or whether it's just adding a textural sort of underbelly to what the violin 1s are doing. So the violin 2s are really just, they're another they're another violin that you have the capability to use that allow you to create even more complex and even more in-depth sounds and more multi-dimensional sounds. And that's why the string section is split up in between the violin 1, 2, violas, cellos, and the basses, is because all of them work together to sort of create one specific sound. And of course, in orchestration, there's so many different orchestration tactics that allow you to sort of use each of them and sort of showcase their sort of own abilities. For example, first of all, the bass players and the viola players usually get very, very annoyed at a lot of composers' pieces, usually when they're playing live, because the viola players and the bass players usually have very, very simple parts, and they usually want to do more than just dun 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 dun, sort of stuff like that. So it really becomes cool when you begin to sort of use each of the instruments in the string section to their full capabilities. And that's the exact same with the woodwind sections. With the flutes, you have 2 flutes, 2 oboes, you have clarinets, and you use all of them to their full capability, and it allows you to sort of it really, when you have each one of those things sort of doing their own thing, but all together it sounds awesome and it works together. That's first of all called counterpoint. It's when everything works in a sort of homogeneous way, and it sort of melds together and creates an awesome sound. Even though all of them are different, it still works together in one unified way. But yeah, so that's a very important part of orchestration as well, to sort of understand each of the instruments and to sort of one thing that's really, really good exercise for understanding all the different instruments in the orchestra and how they sort of function in a big orchestra setting is that go ahead and try to write a piece of music. Don't write it to any film or anything like that. Think about something, someone, some place that you were in your life, and sort of break that place or break that person down and sort of attach different instruments to certain attributes of that place or of that person, and you can actually create a piece using instruments to describe certain things, and it'll make a lot of sense. And that's a lot of the times why orchestration is so helpful and understanding it is so helpful, because in a composer's mind, when scoring a film or when doing anything like that, as he begins to understand and as he begins to break down the meaning of the film and what the film really is supposed to tell the audience, he can sort of use orchestration to explain that. And that's why, when a lot of composers write scores, the people, the film reviewers or whatever will ask, how did you make the certain instrumentation choices on this score? And they'll sort of talk about, why they did. If it's... One good example is Rupert Gregson-Williams recently on the Hacksaw Ridge score. On the Hacksaw Ridge score, he used a cello and a bassoon as his main theme. He had this very, very cool theme with a cello and bassoons, and he said he wanted to do it because he wanted like a very sort of dry, really cool type sound, and so he used those 2 instruments together since they sort of work very, very well in a orchestration setting. The bassoons and the cellos work awesomely. If you guys ever want to try that out. And so this section, as I said, I just sort of wanted to outline that sort of harmonic style. So we have, of course, the and of course we go to that F sharp major chord, which feels very, very nice. For example, I can go ahead and play that. So we have the F minor. Then we go to the B flat major. Then we go to the F sharp major. Then we go back to the... Yeah, let's listen to that again. Sweet. Okay, so it's a pretty simple piece, and I just sort of took you through it and just sort of showed you what's going on here. Of course, we have these violin 1. This violin 1 did like a little run when it went up to this section. That sounded sort of weird because of the, see, that's the one thing about this, you know, it sounds very, very odd because of the fact that it wasn't designed to do runs like this. So you might actually want to, because I was actually listening to that in the context of a full mix. So what you might want to do is do something like, I'd probably say, probably want to pull up like violin 1, and then you'd want to do like a string run articulation from Cinematic Strings 2. But in the context of a full mix, can't even hear it at all, as well as when it's doubled with the harps, and it works very, very well with the harps. So the harps by themselves are like this. So, you know, the harps are very, very busy in this little section. You know, they're going like, let's see. Wow, and of course when this harp patch is so glitchy, because whenever you like load it, after like 30 minutes, it just like gets weird and it stops working. So you have to like reload it all the time. That's why I usually freeze the harp patch. But yeah. So what the harps are pretty much doing is they're just like, they're being very, very exciting and rhythmic. So in this case, you know, of course it has the, and sort of does that whole thing. Then it, of course, when it did that whole run, it pretty much did like an octatonic scale. So it does like every other note. And once it builds up, like I said, it's being very, very rhythmic and just adding that very complex part of the orchestra. So yeah, that's what that's doing there. And then if we just look at it from a broad view, let's go to listen to it again and see if anything I missed on this one. And then back to the tonic. And that's the resolution there. Just goes back to the tonic. Goes to that C7, then back to F. So yeah. So as you guys can tell, the main thing that made that piece really complex is just the way that the orchestration worked. It's very, very busy and exciting in terms of the orchestration with stuff like stuff like that. And so, like I said, it all works together well, but if you listen to each of the parts separately, they all sound so sort of different. But when they work together, they work in a very homogeneous way, which is why counterpoint is so important, understanding how multiple different voices playing different sort of rhythmic things work together well. So yeah, the percussion is very, very, very simplistic on this one. So we just sort of have... We have our timpanis as well as these big Easter Island hits, which are pretty much this like big low taiko thingy, I think. Not taikos, but sort of like really gigantic drums that are very, very low. Just sort of these puncture the main hits. And then we add in our snares, then we add in our, let's see, yeah, Cine Perc Epic. And so, of course, the snares are sort of doubling up with our trumpets and our woodwinds. So we sort of have, so like, yeah. And so as you guys can tell, the thing that makes that really, really nice is the fact that these low timpani hits are hitting with all of the cine perc hits, and those two double together sound really, really cool. Where is that? Here. And then, of course, we have our big cymbals, which I don't use too much, but I do use on the parts that I really need to stick out. So yeah. So that's pretty much that piece. It's pretty self-explanatory. So let's sort of take a second to sort of step back, and we're going to take a look at orchestration and sort of how it works in this type of context, as well as in the type of context that we're going to talk about after this, which is a more modern cinematic type feel. So orchestration, right? In an orchestra, you have your strings, you have your brass, you have your winds, and you have your percussion. In cinematic music, we sort of add on the whole area of synthesizers, and I sort of see percussion different from sort of the type of percussion that we use nowadays, which is like the gigantic cinematic percussion along with the sort of hybrid percussion. So I sort of see those as three different things because they're so incredibly different from something like the regular percussion that you use like in an orchestral setting like this, which for example would be like, you know, the bass drums, you'd have your snares, stuff like that. That's a much more sort of conservative way to use percussion, you know, comparison to what we use nowadays, which is pretty crazy. And you guys might have heard the song that I played before this, the Onward piece that I did last week, which has some pretty gigantic taikos in there, and it's a very modern sort of take on percussion. So here's that little thing. So it introduces the percussion, and then it gets fun. So yeah, that's pretty much just like, you know, taikos, some cool sort of Hans Zimmer percussion type, you know, flams on those hits. But yeah, so that's, I sort of look at those as three different types of things. And then, you know, one of the primary things that you guys have to keep in mind is that for each different score, the orchestration is going to be pretty much different. So if you guys, a really good thing to try to do and to try to study is to try to understand how specific film scores work with specific orchestrational type settings. So how Star Wars would be different from how, you know, Gladiator was orchestrated or something like that. And primarily the orchestration, when a lot of people say, oh, that orchestration in Star Wars, they're going to be referring to stuff in the realm of this, like, or add in these. And they're going to be referring to all those very sort of complex counterpointy type rhythmic things, which, you know, for the most part, I would sort of contribute that to both John Williams's knowledge in orchestration, but also his knowledge in counterpoint and how instruments work together. That's probably one of the most important things to keep in mind when orchestrating a piece, is learning how the instruments work together. You know, in order to do that, you have to start out learning how all the instruments work themselves. So, of course, in the string section, we have our violins, we have our violin 2, we have our viola, our cellos, and our basses. So our basses are going to be pretty much at this, you know, of course, the lower section. Our cellos are going to be up here, you know, I would say between like C2, C3, C4. And then we're gonna have our violas, which are pretty much, I like to usually write my stuff in the range of C3, C4, up to like sort of G4. Yeah, pretty much that's like where I like that. And then, of course, we have our violins up here, which works very, very well. And, you know, when you're orchestrating a piece, a really, really good little tip that you guys can do is that if you guys want that really gigantic Howard Shore type melodic line going on, what I recommend that you guys do is you sort of take these stringed instruments and you sort of spread them out throughout the whole entire keyboard. So you have your basses at this lower section, you have your cellos up here, you have your violas on this octave, then you have your violin 2s here and your violin 1s here. And when you have it spread across the whole entire keyboard, it's just like mind-blowing because of how well it works together. But of course, the thing that you have to keep in mind with all this type of stuff is that you want your, you know, for the most part, you're going to want your chord to be sort of spelled across all of this type of stuff. So, you know, let's just pull up a string ensemble patch just for the hell of it. right? Okay, so we have, let's just say we have this chord, right? Or we'll no, actually, you guys have probably seen the Hans Zimmer trailer. We'll do like the sort of Hans Zimmer type thing, or the. Right. So yeah, you pretty much when you're orchestrating and when you're actually writing the music for the whole entire string section, you want to keep in mind you want to make sure that your chord, all the notes in your chord, the 1, the 3, and the 5, or if you have like a diminished chord, you want to make sure it's spelled throughout the whole entire keyboard, or throughout the whole entire however you are orchestrating. You just want to make sure your chord is spelled, because what a lot of people will sort of forget to do is when they have these big, like, when pretty much they just pull up a big string ensemble patch and they say that's that, and I'll just leave that. Like, the best stuff comes out when you actually orchestrate it for a whole string section, and you actually have all the different instruments playing different notes. So of course, like for something like this, we would have. See how those two instruments are playing different notes, and then you add in the third voice, which is playing the other note of the chord. So yeah, that's the whole thing about that. You just want to make sure that your chord is sort of being spelled out, however you want to orchestrate your piece. And another really good thing to keep in mind regarding orchestration is that, a lot of people, human beings are generally, their default is sort of lazy. So they like to just, pull up a string patch and, they'll just sort of play everything in. And they'll be like, okay, that's done. Okay, I'll go do my brass section. And then they have their whole brass section. Where's my brass? Oh yeah, they'll have like. And trust, that's not orchestrating. That's not orchestrating. Orchestrating is when you actually, go to the full sort of section, and then you orchestrate, you add, and you sort of distribute all the different voices throughout the whole entire section. And so just pulling up a big ensemble patch, that's not orchestrating. And a lot of theorists and stuff will argue, oh, well, heck, this isn't orchestrating. But, honestly, the world has evolved. We now use MIDI. We now use samples. That's how we write music. It's the quickest way to do it. It's the best way to do it. And so, yeah, it's orchestrating. Yeah. I mean, if they're going to count orchestrating by pretty much having and distributing all the different voices and everything throughout the whole entire sections and doing all that type of stuff, then this is definitely orchestrating. Oh, yeah, we're just now about to get in this piece. Okay, what the hell? But yeah. Okay, so now we have, so our brass section, we of course have our trumpets, we have our trombones, we have our French horns, and of course that's sort of going to be distributed in a similar way to the string section. So you have your tubas, you'll have your trombones, then you'll have your French horns, then you'll have your trumpets. And then of course if you have stuff like bass trombones, you can of course add that to the equation. As well as if you have all those different instruments such as, and it's very important to keep in mind, instruments like the Descant Horn and the Wagner tuba aren't necessarily meant to add to like a French horn or add to, add to the orchestral setting, but they're meant to be an extension, sort of, if you need to get into that range that instrument doesn't offer, that allows you to do that. So, yeah. And then, of course, in your winds, you're going to have your flutes, your clarinets, your oboes. You're going to have and then, of course, you'd have, like, the alto flute, and then you have the bass clarinet and everything like that. You'd have your bassoons. And, of course, you have the single reeds and the double reeds. And they're quite different on how they sound, but most importantly, how they're played. And then, of course, we have our percussion section, which, would be stuff like, for example, if we had the more contemporary type percussion, that'd be, taikos, pretty much the whole Hans Zimmer percussion section of my template here, all this type of stuff. But yeah, in a more conservative type orchestral setting, you'd have, bass drums, you'd have, let's sort of see here, of course, your cymbals, everything like that. You'd have snares, big bass drums, and etc. So the first thing I want to start out by doing before we get a little bit more into all this type of stuff is to sort of talk about, what are some tips on how to get good at orchestration and how to get better at orchestration throughout a certain period of time. And one of the best ways that I think, you can get better at orchestration is to be able to listen to pieces, sit down, listen to one of your favorite orchestral pieces. For me, on this show, actually, I like to do rescores, and I also like to do behind the scores. And behind the scores are pretty much when I sort of listen to a piece, and by ear, I fully orchestrate the piece over again. So I start out with nothing, and I'll fully orchestrate it and recreate it. So I did that, with Narnia. I did that with Inception. I did that with Da Vinci Code. Just really, really big Hollywood scores. And I sort of wanted to take those types of things, and then, of course, from there, completely rebuild it from the bottom up. So that's a very, very good thing for you guys to be able to do, just to sort of try to do your best to recreate a film score. And once you have, and once you've gotten very, very, very close to it, that really, really helps you in your own writing. So that's something I recommend. And so, tips on being realistic. Being realistic with your strings, your brass, and your winds, and overall having a very realistic mock-up and demo. The most important things that you guys... What the hell? The most important things that you guys have to keep in mind is you definitely use automation, use modulation, use volume, use automation with, of course, plugins. So, of course, if you have like a cutoff on a filter, being able to actually automate the cutoff so that it feels very natural, and it doesn't feel very like machine-like and everything like that. Also, use healthy doses of reverb. It's not very normal, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense to put everything like on full reverb, and then everything just sounds like a big sort of like concoction of randomness. Like it all sounds so like ambient and everything. It's very weird. So if you want like realism and you want it to sound like it's recorded on a soundstage, you need to be able to know how the mic positions work with each other, know where the decade trees are usually recorded, where the close mics are recorded, and then of course and know where the ambience and everything like that. So therefore you'll be able to recreate the sounds that you would want to create for that sort of realistic orchestral setting. Also, don't just stomp big chords on string ensemble patches and then say, okay, I'm done with that. That's not realistic at all, simply because of the fact that when you are sort of doing that, usually that's going to be like for a more patty type thing. That's what I do here, right? I have the full string section orchestrated, and then from there I have is this sort of lower string pad that I'm using this string ensemble from Majestica. So yeah, that's very important to be able to not necessarily just impulsively, play big chords and then say, okay, done. Also, multi-voice writing is very important. Like I said beforehand, writing in different voices, very, very good. Finding the patch that is right for your style. For example, you're not going to want to use a patch from Majestica for a period drama score. You're going to want to use something from Albion 2. You're going to want to use, something that is much more restrictive in terms of its giganticness, right? So, if something like this... You're not going to use that like on a big, on a small little, Downton Abbey type score or Alexandre Desplat period drama score. You're going to want to figure out what patch works best for what you are specifically doing. So, for something like this, this is a much more sort of epic type string patch. So like, what is it from Harry Potter? So that'd be the type of thing for that, as well as the string ensemble. It's like it's very gigantic, as you guys can tell. That's why I did the whole Hans Zimmer thing. But yeah, and that I love this thing because it has the fifth and the bass, which most obnoxious theorists will be like, never put the fifth in the bass, but it sounds so badass. It works awesomely. But anyway, so this piece we're going to take a look at now is by Trevor Morris, and this is actually for the Vikings score. And this is sort of one of the beautiful themes that that was in season 3. It's pretty much when everyone thought Ragnar died or whatever, and there was sort of this beautiful, beautiful theme that played, and I was like, "Damn, this is awesome!" It has a very Zimmery feel, but it's very original, and I love it. It's awesome. So we're gonna sort of take a look at this, and I'll show you how I orchestrated it. So let's sort of listen to what I have so far. Cool. So as you guys can tell, it had this gigantic sound, and the way that the strings, the strings were so sort of warm, and the brass worked very, very well with that because we had a very sort of warm, French horn, type thing. Instead of if we were to just like automatically go in and be like, right? It works much more well. It's much more restrictive and conservative, and it sort of allows you to build. And by the way, this sort of warm type patch works much better with the cellos. So the whole secret to something like this, you guys might have heard in a lot of different film scores, these sort of really, really big sounding strings. You guys might automatically just go to like a string ensemble patch and try to replicate that sound, but that's sort of not how you do it. The first thing that you have to do is, of course, you could sort of sketch whatever you're going to want to do in an ensemble patch, like something like this. But that sound alone won't do it. It's when you add in then your trombones, French horns, choirs, subs, brass. So I'm just to sort of talk about the libraries that I used here. So the main strings that I use in this piece are from Cinematic Studio strings. They're some of the best strings I've ever used, and mainly the only strings that I tend to use are from like Cinematic Studio strings, Cinematic Strings 2, or Soaring strings. I love Soaring strings for the main melodies, for example. So the cello is, it has a very sort of tight feel, and it's beautiful. It's definitely beautiful, and it allows you to play much more sort of articulate lines than something like Cinematic Studio strings. Something like that, or like a So yeah, rather than something like this, which still allows you to play pretty beautiful lines, but not as quick and everything like that. But it definitely has that filmic tone. That's the thing that I love about cinematic studio strings, is that it sounds like, if you orchestrate it well, it sounds like it was recorded in a orchestra hall versus some other ones that are a bit more sort of hard to make out. So yeah, that's the cool thing about cinematic studio strings. It's definitely a beautiful library. So, of course, we have in our string section, let's just sort of talk about the way that I orchestrated this. So the main melody is going to be doubled with the French horn, of course. So we have our French horn here. Let's just sort of listen to that alone. So yeah, like I said, that cello and the French horn work very, very well together. And then let's sort of add in our second voice, which is going to be our violas. And that type of thing is what makes it flow so well, is the fact that I use this common note here that pretty much it sort of hung on to the next chord and it still worked, which is very, very nice, because you don't need to constantly be changing notes, which takes away from the very flowy type feel. So yeah, now let's add in our second cellos. And now we'll add in this little pad. Well, actually, let's add in this little pad here. Then it sort of builds in dynamics.